4 million Western voting women to force the passage of the suffrage amendment to bring the vote to the 20 million voteless women of the eastern states. Mrs. Alva Belmont, with the lovely new font there in the center, a wealthy supporter of the CU, gave the first speech at the opening luncheon of this convention. Belmont informed the participants that the women voters of the 12 enfranchised states are met here to form a body politic. The Western women, with the power of the ballot in her hand, will give to her enslaved sister justice and freedom. Trusting that favorable circumstances would appear, Alice Paul secured the support of Sarah Barfield and Frances Jolliffe to take the huge petition to Washington. The favorable circumstances occurred when 2 Swedish immigrants from Rhode Island who were living or visiting in San Francisco had purchased a car and were planning on driving it back to Rhode Island, and they offered their services. Sarah Barfield was a little reluctant to do this. She had originally planned to start a new book of poetry in the fall of 1915, but Alice Paul told her, "But you're doing this work now." When Field pointed out the lack of adequate service stations along the route, Paul responded that if something happened, "I'm sure some good man will come along to help you." Paul later recalled that the automobile trip was the easiest and least expensive way to have the suffrage campaign. Drive into a town, speak on the car at a street corner, and here we were in San Francisco, and we had to get the petition to Washington. The weather was still good. Sarah was out there, free to go, willing and lovely. A very good speaker. She was just sent to us from heaven. Paul realized that the trip held great symbolic potential as a transcontinental drive to win suffrage. The CU weekly newspaper, The Suffragist, announced the trip and christened the travelers as suffrage envoys, co-opting a diplomatic term to symbolize the message that the voting women of the West carried the voice of the new power, the woman's vote, to the country of men who blocked the same freedom for other women. The tight schedule and continuous press releases situated Field as a visiting dignitary, risking her life to get to each town and conduct important business. The journey. The car was loaded with the Great Demand banner, the massive petition, and their luggage. The first stop for the envoys was in Sacramento, and it was here that Frances Jolliffe dropped out of the trip due to illness. They had been on the road for days. That meant then that the remaining part of the journey was going to be held with Sarah Barfield and the 2 Swedish drivers who you can see here portrayed in front of the car. Sarah Barfield, so they made this journey. Field's lover and future husband, the lawyer poet Charles Erskine Scott Wood, had come down from Portland before they left San Francisco. He presented her with a buffalo fur robe to use on the trip to keep her warm, and that was an item that became extremely welcome, as we'll see. Field, by this point, recalled being pretty shaken by things, because everything had happened very quickly. And then here she is now shouldered with the burden of doing the rest of this journey by herself with the 2 Swedish women who she did not know. A significant member of the team who prepared the way for the envoys was Mabel Vernon, a seasoned organizer for the CU. Vernon served as the advance press agent, parade organizer, and she traveled ahead of the envoys via train to make arrangements for autocades, bands, mayors, congressmen, and governors to greet the trio when they arrived. Vernon recalled that she planned about 100 Usually, she had some names of people who were active in suffrage or suffrage friendly, could be interested, and then from there, she used those people to help quickly plan a lot of these events. Field and the Swedes would stop outside of their next destination, put the banner on the car, and then meet up with the planned autocade, which was roughly sometimes between 10 to 20 automobiles. At each stop along the way, new chapters of the Congressional Union formed, and monetary donations helped defray the expenses incurred along the trip. At each stop also, new signatures were added to the petition, often by the male politicians and others present at the reception speeches. Sarah Barfield was quite familiar with open-air meetings. Here you can see what one typically looked like. She was familiar with this because she had worked in the suffrage campaigns that were successful in Oregon and in Nevada. Nevada women had won the right to vote in November of 1914. Alice Paul had hoped for regular reports from the road, but with the incredibly full schedule of travel and meetings, it was often difficult for Field to write long reports. She often relied on a quick sketch dashed off to Maple Vernon or on a telegram sent back to headquarters that was expanded in the newspaper The Suffragist. Even her lover didn't receive letters from the road often. They were just telegrams. Hi, made it here, long day, next stop is, Nebraska or something. So here they are on this journey, and it was not a straight and direct route they took. They went from San Francisco to Sacramento to Reno to Fallon and Lovelock and Winnemucca. Somewhere outside of Winnemucca, they followed a wagon trail, a wrong one, and being mapless, they got hopelessly lost. Driving around the Great Basin, aka the Great American Desert. They were expected in Salt Lake City the next day and traveled all night without any sleep, searching for signs or guidance. Finally, when the light was just breaking, they spotted a ranch, the Ivanpah Ranch. And the ranchers, according to Field, were kindness itself, providing the travelers with a warm fire, hot coffee, which Field said, I don't have a doubt that it was abominable stuff, but it seemed to me the most wonderful drink I have ever had in my life. And then they, for a small fee, they got a huge breakfast, and best of all, a nap. They knew then the direct way to get to Salt Lake City, and they made it in time to be whisked to the state capitol for a meeting. And there we see Sarah Barfield speaking in Salt Lake. Field wrote about that meeting to headquarters that night, and she said, while the earth was glowing in the light of a flaming sunset, and the mountains about stood like everlasting witnesses, Representative Joseph Howell pledged his full and unqualified support for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. From Salt Lake, the envoys spent the next few days traveling through Wyoming, where they encountered snow. By this point, they've been on the road for a couple of weeks, and they were pretty inured to the changes in climate. They had warm clothes, you had that buffalo road, and they never changed the schedule. They didn't wait for a storm to pass before they moved forward. They just kind of plowed. They never knew when they would be held up. When it got really cold, they stopped every once in a while to get out of the car and walk around and stamp their feet to get the circulation going. She said, we didn't allow ourselves to just sit hours and hours in the car and freeze into icicles. Remember, cars did not have heating and air conditioning in 1950. Only once did they encounter a snowbank so large that they all had to get out and push to get the car moving again. From Wyoming, they traveled to Colorado, where they held one meeting with the governor in Denver, and then a big, huge reception in Colorado Springs. And I think that was done very deliberately, to have a grand event in Colorado Springs, because from that point forward, they were traveling into what they called enemy country, i.e. the non-suffrage states. The exception was Illinois, which had recently granted women the vote in national elections. Well, so they're driving through Kansas. And while making their way to Emporia, they had a mishap which turned into a publicity boom for them. Late one rainy night, the car stalled in a huge puddle of mud. And the car sank deeper and deeper. They got out and tried to push it, but the car just sank deeper and deeper into the mud, and they were covered in mud. Field remembered that they had passed a farmhouse a few miles back, but they were in really an isolated and remote, kind of unpopulated section of Kansas, which we could say very fairly still exists today. So they were looking for assistance. So Sarah Barfield volunteers. She goes out. It's the middle of the night. It's still raining. She hikes back what she thinks is about 2 miles, but it felt like 10. Slogging her way through this muddy path, at times sinking up to her knees. Finally, she arrived at this farmhouse, which indeed existed, and it's the middle of the night, and she wakes this farmer up and asks for assistance. You can imagine, mud-spattered woman, high, and she had to explain to him kind of why they were out there in the middle of the mud, in the middle of this nowhere. So the astounded farmer agreed to help and took 2 horses and his truck and helped get them out. And I guess what Alice Paul said, that some good man would come along to help, actually did happen. The bemused farmer refused payment for this assistance and told them, "You have paid me by letting me see what some women can undertake." They arrived at a hotel in Emporia in a sorry state. After much discussion and a rather large tip, the proprietor gave them keys to hotel rooms, and they sent their clothes out to a cleaner. They weren't traveling with a huge trunk of clothing. They had a limited number of outfits, so this was important. While waiting for the clothes to be returned, the editor of the Emporia Gazette, William Allen White, showed up for an interview with Field and had to do so from her room. She didn't have clean clothes. She was in her bed with the sheets pulled up, she hoped, modestly covering her up, and for the whole interview. And William Allen White said this is a very French way of doing things. The editorial he wrote was humorous and filled with warmth. They got on famously, he said, until they struck Nickerson and stuck in the mud. And having no man along to do the swearing, it was sheer strength and moral courage that got them through. But they had to wade in the mud up to their hose supporters. In Topeka, Sarah Barfield and others for the first time missed a meeting. Second mishap. Mabel Vernon had traveled ahead and was there in Topeka. The press lined up, a band lined up, and autocade also organized for the arrival. The women of the city of Topeka had procured letters of endorsement from every official that they could contact, from the Attorney General of the state to the state printer. A huge crowd was there, and there were no envoys. And there were no envoys. And so Mabel Vernon, being a seasoned organizer herself, started speaking and talking about the nature of the trip and what had happened so far and how they've been traveling. And for 2 hours, she speaks to this audience that was still waiting for these envoys to show up. They were stuck with tire trouble and engine trouble about 60 miles away from Topeka. So after 2 hours, Mabel Vernon said, well, we've got to figure out what's going on. Thank you all for coming, and the crowd goes on their merry way. But these disasters in Kansas actually brought added publicity about the dangers and the difficulty of such an undertaking, and actually brought them more support. There were other unexpected things that happened along the way. The day-to-day reality of making such a trek in 1915 was grueling. Field Road. We get up at 6 a.m., jolt, bump, bounce, and shake over 100 miles of awful roads to land weary to the breaking point at the next destination. The wonder and celebration that greeted them did provide some salve to their weary bones. Field informed her fiancé at one point that the alkali dust and wind has chapped my lips, which are swollen beyond recognition and very painful. Her details of the roads themselves are pretty telling of the difficulty of such a long journey. They jolted and shook in the boiling sun. Their backs ached from the continuous bumps and joggle of the car. Other troubles came not from the weather, the car, the roads, but from outsiders, most likely anti-suffragists, who were spreading rumors and innuendos via letters claiming that Sarah Barfield was a bad woman who had abandoned her children to take this trip. It was a common kind of tactic. Field recalled later that one of the anti-tactics was to blemish the reputations of the suffragists, but she said that when people heard her speak earnestly about suffrage and her concern for women's progress and welfare, it seemed to wipe out any of the evil suggestions that some of those critics would make. However, she did note that sometimes such rumors seemed to just reassure the antis that all the suffragists were dubious characters. Antis also began appearing in the crowds from Illinois onward to echo her. She became very adept at handling them with humor and wit, and often there were enough pro-suffrage people of the audience that basically tended to silence them. The journey, they went from Kansas to Nebraska and Iowa and into Chicago, where there was a grand reception, with a huge parade down Michigan Avenue and a sea of people in front of the Art Institute steps. Indianapolis, Columbus, Detroit. So we're talking, here's their trip, their this jagged kind of route, which is why it took more than 5,000 miles. At each stop along the way, they gathered a lot of signatures. There were 4,000 new signatures in Detroit alone, which was Field's hometown. She stayed there for a couple of days, and that enabled more signatures to be added. Who knows how long the petition would have been had they been able to stop for a couple of days at each stop along the way. From Detroit, they went to Cleveland, where they had a big crowd and a swirling snowstorm. From Cleveland, they drove into New York, where the car suffered a broken axle in Syracuse. Fearing that this would cause them to lose time, Field got on the telephone to the car manufacturer, which was in Ohio, saying, we need a new axle because the garage didn't have one. And the manufacturer put a new axle on the train, sent it to Syracuse, the garage picked it up, and they were able to repair the vehicle and get them onto their next destination without losing that kind of time. In Albany, they met the governor of New York. And this is interesting because in 1915, New York, as well as Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Massachusetts, have all defeated suffrage amendments in those states. The The governor of New York basically looked at Sarah Barfield and said, I thought you would be 10 feet tall. From Albany, they went to Boston, which was a stronghold of the anti-suffrage movement. Despite this, many people gathered to hear them speak, and Mabel Vernon, as well as Frances Jolliffe, who had recovered well enough, had taken the train from San Francisco to Albany, met up with them, right, made the rest of the journey. The governor of Massachusetts offered a letter of personal endorsement, but kept telling Mabel Vernon, don't ask me to sign the petition, though. Don't ask me to sign the petition. From Boston, they stopped in Providence, leaving the two Swedes behind for a few days, but they sent the car ahead via boat into New York City, and Sarah Barfield, Mabel Vernon, and Frances Jolliffe took the train to New York City. The battered little car, covered with dents, stickers from cities all over the continent, landed in New York City to be driven in the biggest parade yet for the trip. The New York Sun reported that Fifth Avenue rubbed its eyes when the weather-beaten automobile bearing the slogan, "On to Congress," and followed by 100 other cars, blazed a path of purple and gold down the great thoroughfare. They had a huge meeting, and the New York suffrage leaders who had been so disheartened by their defeat were excited about this arrival of this entourage. Field said, here was a new movement and a new spirit coming in from the West, and here was a new promise of support, not from impotent and non-voting women, but from strong and voting women. This gave the suffragists in New York heart, as it did for other Eastern women. And finally, the journey begins to draw to a close. The battered overland vehicle arrived in Washington, D.C. after quick stops in Newark, Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore. The Swedes rejoined them at this point, this final phase. Sarah Barfield, whose vigor was beginning to wane from the many weeks of being on the road and with so many public appearances, arrived triumphantly in the capital city on December 5th, the day before Congress was to convene in a new session. There was a grand procession assembled. Women on horseback, each representing a suffrage state, flag and banner bearers wearing long purple capes with gold collars, hundreds of others carrying purple, white, and gold pennants, which was the colors of the Congressional Union. Distinguished guests, and finally, the great petition, unrolled to only 100 feet, because they would have needed like 1,000 people to carry it if it, it's fully extended 18,000 feet. The battered little car led the procession with Field, Jolliffe, Vernon, and the two Swedes inside. They arrived at the steps of the Capitol, where they were met by a large delegation of congressmen. The envoys exchanged speeches with Senator George Sutherland, Republican of Utah, and Representative Franklin Wheeler Mondale, Republican of Wyoming. Sutherland actually introduced the suffrage amendment for congressional approval that fall in that session. After these speeches, they went to the White House, where they were greeted by President Woodrow Wilson in the East Room. Wilson, who stated many times that only the states could make changes to the voting status of women, very cordially met with them. There were like 300 in this East Room. The entire petition was in that East Room. And Field told the president that many of the signatures contained on that massive document were from those of governors, mayors, and congressmen of the cities through which they had passed. And then Wilson spoke. I hope it is true that I am not a man stiffly set beyond the possibility of learning. Nothing could be more impressive than the presentation of such a request in such numbers and backed by such influences as undoubtedly stand behind you. He did tell them that he could not change his State of the Union address, which he was planning on delivering, because he'd already sent it to the press and could not change it. Code word for I'm not going to move on this. But he did tell them, this visit of yours will remain in my mind, not only as a very delightful compliment, but also as a very impressive thing, which undoubtedly will make it necessary for all of us to consider very carefully what it is right for us to do. The women were jubilant. They thought this meant that he would support the constitutional amendment. He did not until 3 years later, after many other events and actions which brought him to publicly support the constitutional amendment. A summing up, a tally. So what then did this little gasoline flight across the country accomplish? It meant waking up to national suffrage. Previous suffrage activities did not receive as much press coverage as did this cross-country voyage. Alice Paul understood very clearly the power of the little dramas that occurred on the road and emphasized these striking details in press releases. The trip of daring brought the case of women's suffrage to the national conversation and caused some people to rethink their views about the issue. It demonstrated that a new spirit abounded and the Western women could become a force with which to be reckoned. And that made all the sacrifice and effort worth it. As Sarah Barfield said of the trip, I only know that we made history. And the trip was not a joke.
And fiercely independent and the love of my life. She is a strong-willed, wonderful, giving Latina woman. The second woman I see every day, Monday through Thursday, is Dr. Haley Westmoreland. And it usually goes like this. You're usually there before me. But sometimes I get there before. The conversation goes like this. Oh my God, did you see Walking Dead last night? Oh my, did you guys see Walking Dead on holy, whoa.
I usually answer, not yet.
Yes.
No spoilers.
And I think this is your fault, right? You guys, they have been pathologically behind on the DVR, so I'm like, I want to talk about last night's Justified. I'm like, oh, you saw Monday's Better Call Saul. It's like, ah. Anyway, it's always a pleasure. She's a dear friend. She's a professor of English here, and she is going to give a talk. So Dr. Cannon Westmoreland is going to give a talk entitled Ballbusters, Bombshells, and Bored Housewives. The Sexy Feminism of Mad Men. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Westmoreland.
Thank you very much. First I'm going to read two quotes. The first one is from Jennifer Keisha Armstrong and Heather Wood Rudolph. You can be a feminist right now. You can start at any moment, altering your life one little decision at a time. It doesn't call for a major upheaval, most likely. It just requires commitment to being more conscious, something you've undoubtedly done before when you counted calories and flirted with calories, or decoded your boyfriend's every move, or applied your makeup just like the women's magazine told you to. Except this time, we're asking all of you to do this in the name of women, in the name of your mothers, sisters, friends, coworkers, and of course, yourselves. Now it's time for you to find your own sexy feminism. The second quote is from Don Draper while he is advertising, or he's doing a pitch for the Kodak Carousel Style project. In Greek, nostalgia literally means a pain from an old wound. It's a twinge in your heart, far more powerful than memory alone. This device isn't a spaceship, it's a time machine. It goes backwards and forwards and takes us to a place where we ache to go again. It lets us travel the way a child travels, round and around and back again, to a place where we know we are loved. In an era in which women's rights are threatened in an increasingly conservative political landscape, and the very definition of feminism is fraught with ambiguity and misunderstanding, examining the female characters of Mad Men may sharply illuminate our continuing struggle with these contemporary issues. Rather than simply providing a window into the emerging feminist movement of the 1960s, Mad Men's nostalgic but clear-eyed vision of that time period can elucidate the current state of and shifting cultural attitudes toward women's basic rights. Mad Men presents bold yet nuanced depictions of women and subtly explores emerging feminisms. As with any textual analysis, especially a feminist one, it's important not to focus solely on whether a character overtly lays claim to a movement, but how and what that character's actions and attitudes reveal about the world around them. If patriarchy is a world of so-called mad men, what about the women? What can we learn about the emergence of social consciousness and personal empowerment by watching a show that in its very title eschews women, that often brutally depicts the sexism of that era, and that often presents our potential heroines as flawed and sometimes complicit in their own oppression? Does Matthew Weiner create a brand of feminism that is palatable to multiple generations of viewers? Is it, in fact, sexy? Examining Jennifer Keisha Armstrong's and Heather Wood Rudolph's text, Sexy Feminism, A Girl's Guide to Love, Success, and Style, will help us determine the answer to this question. While Mad Men has often been labeled a feminist show, even by its creator, Matthew Weiner, a consideration of the complexity of its feminist message and its progressive, recalcitrant female characters and consistent sisterhoods is an essential step in understanding how the past informs our present struggles and how the personal is almost always very political. From its inception, Mad Men's prominent female characters, most notably Joan Harris Holloway and Peggy Olson, as well as Betty Draper and Megan Calvé Draper, have embodied a struggle against the rigid gender roles ascribed to women in an increasingly dynamic work setting of the 1960s. Their interactions with the Mad Men of the show, as well as with each other, reveal power struggles that may seem initially foreign to some viewers. man who designed it made it simple enough for a woman to use. That was the first time I ever shuddered watching. She also tells her to brutally evaluate her physical strengths and weaknesses by staring at herself naked in front of a mirror, ostensibly in preparation for the inevitable sexual advances and dalliances with her male colleagues.